Romans 12 and 2 reads this way: do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. Another translation directly from the Greek could be, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. Another translation, the TWS 2 translation, would read this way: do not conform any longer to what the crows are saying, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. God's good, pleasing, and perfect will. Before you sit down, repeat today's subject with me. Look at somebody sitting close to you and say, neighbor, oh neighbor, don't sing with the crows. You may be seated.
All right, Reverend.
My sisters and brothers, I would venture to say that two of the most profound and powerful works of intellectual and academic rigor of the 20th century were written by two brothers that were intellectual giants. One gentleman, now long gone, was Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Professor Woodson has two books that I would urge every member, young, middle-aged, and old, to get a copy of. You can download them now on your iPad, your Kindle, your e-reader, or you can pick up a hard copy. The first book he wrote that I would suggest everybody get a copy of is The Miseducation of the Negro. The Miseducation of the Negro. Another title that many people are not aware of is a companion book entitled The Education of the Negro Prior to 1861. Those two books will help you understand our current condition as a people better than you've ever understood it before. The second intellectual giant is a gentleman by the name of W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the founders of the NAACP, a Pan-Africanist, a great intellectual scholar, the first to receive a PhD from Harvard University. His classic book that no library should be without and that every high school, college student should have a copy of is a text entitled The Souls of Black Folk. Both of these intellectual giants, Du Bois and Woodson, discovered that after emancipation, the question for Southerners and for anti-slavery Northerners alike was this: do people kissed by nature's son have the intellectual capacity to learn? Do people who have melanin in their skin, do people that are not the color of the flesh-colored Band-Aid? Come on, somebody. Y'all didn't notice that, did you? Do you have the intellectual capacity to learn? Or are you simply mental infants that are doomed to live a life of servitude? Du Bois and Woodson both clearly state that education provided by the Freedmen's Bureau and missionary schools in that day failed to meet the needs of a post-Civil War free African slave. After Africans were emancipated, there was a plan to deal with them. For those who may not be familiar, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up after emancipation to provide schooling and housing for freed Africans. And out of the Freedmen's Bureau came the idea of 40 acres and a mule. Many of the schools set up by the Freedmen's Bureau and Northern missionaries unintentionally and intentionally miseducated people of African descent because of several fundamental flaws in their educational philosophy. Educational philosophy in education is what educators call pedagogy. And their pedagogy was flawed. They had some wrong assumptions. The first flaw and wrong assumption they made was that led to Africans being miseducated was they decided that they were intellectual midgets, and that education designed to free the mind and emancipate the spirit would be of no value to these recently freed black folk. And while many held this belief, there were others in the South who believed that they can learn, but if you educate people of African descent who are already skilled and intelligent, they would then take over the jobs that should be for poor white Southerners. Because of emancipation and the fear of educated Africans, another organization was created just in case Africans were actually educated and ended up taking somebody else's job. Therefore, in order to take their country back, they created an organization called the Ku Klux Klan. And that organization was specifically designed to make sure that people of African descent would not be educated and threaten the class balance or infrastructure that had developed as a result of slavery. Now remember now, the people who were skilled were us. Come on here, somebody. Come on in here. The blacksmiths were black folk. The people who were metal workers were black folk. The people who knew agriculture and who were growing the crops that fed the world looked like y'all. The skilled labor of the South came from people of African descent. And so the first fundamental flaw of the Freedmen's Bureau was the idea that Africans were intellectual midgets or that their skills would replace those of poor whites. The second flawed assumption was that Africans never contributed anything to civilization. And as a result of these flaws, those who taught people of African descent taught them as if they never existed in history ever before. These assumptions produced some funny things in our community. You see, when our foreparents were educated, they weren't educated in a way to where their education would create something in them where they would go back and connect with their own people. It didn't create something where they would go back and rebuild or build community among people who look like them. And so what happened when the first ones of us received a non-conventional education outside of what was set up by the Freedmen's Bureau, when they got the type of education that the Europeans got, instead of coming back to their own community and trying to build their families and trying to build up their own communities, what they did, they were part of what W.E.B. Du Bois called the talented tenth. They went and decided to assimilate into the wider culture. So what happened, and we still have that problem today, some come out of the hood. You remember them from the hood, right? Yes, sir. You remember before they got their education. Before they started talking with proper diction. You remember them, don't you? When they got in trouble. But all of a sudden they went to that Ivy League school. And they started talking proper. Come on now. And they moved on up to the east side with George and Weezy. They started driving something that didn't come off of mom and pop car lot. Y'all ain't gonna help me. They didn't have to worry about the lemon law, because they had a full warranty on their brand new Lexus, Audi, Mercedes, Beamer. Come on, somebody. And so what happened was the education that they received taught them to try to be more European than they were black. Oh God, y'all, it's going to be rough this morning. You see, education is not about teaching folk how to assimilate, but education should illuminate. Education ought to free your mind, not trap your mind. Education should not chain you to a philosophy or teach you to regurgitate something that you got in the school, but it ought to teach your mind how to critically think for yourself. And that's part of why education has failed in so many instances, because our young people go in and they can regurgitate for the sake of passing the test. But then the information that they regurgitate to pass the test, they don't use it practically in their everyday life, so they never use it ever again, and so it's lost. And so what we do is recite for the purpose of getting a piece of paper. See, education shouldn't chain you. It should set you free. And that's where the Freedmen's Bureau failed. It created a model of education that did not free the mind, and we've continued that antiquated model of education even until this day. And so what Carter G. Woodson came up with, he came up with a term called miseducation. Because anytime education takes you outside of who you are and does not teach you to think critically and teaches you that in order to be accepted in society, you have to assimilate and be somebody else, that's called miseducation. And so he wrote the book, The Miseducation of the Negro, because their miseducation taught them that to be successful, I must now turn my back on my folk, and I've got to assimilate and be like somebody else. So we start walking like other folk, talking like other folk, marrying other folk. Y'all ain't gonna help me. But education ought to free your mind so that you go back and help your folk. Oh, God, help me preach in here. So here's the first thing I need to tell you. As I looked at the scarecrow. The first point I need to tell you is this. Don't get comfortable living in the fields. Would you look at somebody and tell them, don't get comfortable living in the fields? You see, the education system was designed to get our people comfortable being in the field, staying in the field, hanging out in the field, living in the field, marrying in the field, just spending all their time in the field because they would work for somebody else for the rest of their lives in the field. The education was designed to tell them that there's nothing for you beyond this field. There's nothing beyond this place. You must get it in your mind that you cannot look out beyond the field, that you got to stay in this field for the rest of your life. Don't bother trying to leave the field, because you are to stay in the field. And when we looked at Scarecrow, it dawned on me that when I saw the Scarecrow tied up in the field, that there was a connection to our history. And the story was right there on the screen. It's based upon a play by Charles Small and the book by Frank Baum. The Wiz is a story of Dorothy, a young woman from Harlem. They took her out of Kansas and put her in Harlem. She's caught up in a storm and transported to Oz. I preached last week, I'm trying to get out of Oz. And as a result of her arrival in Oz, she comes in, she liberates the Munchkins. We got some Munchkins in here need to be liberated. The Munchkins had been captured by Evermean, who was the sister of Eveline, the Wicked Witch of the West. Dorothy was given silver slippers by the good witch Glinda and told that if she wanted to get out of Oz, she had to find the Wiz, who had the power to get her home. And the only way to the Emerald City was by following the yellow brick road. And all one did was ease on down the road. Now once she's on her journey, she stumbles on a scarecrow. Scarecrow played to perfection by a young Michael Jackson. This was Michael Jackson before Off the Wall. This was Michael Jackson before Thriller. This was Michael Jackson when he was still black. Had his nose and everything. Dorothy stumbles on the scarecrow, and his job was to stay in the field, work in the field. He lives in the field. He's never to leave the field. The scarecrow believes his purpose is only in the field. He don't own the field, but works the field for somebody else. He has to spend his life in the field. Now, being a good scarecrow means that you keep your position of powerlessness. See, when you're a good scarecrow, you stay in your position. When you're being a real good scarecrow, you keep the pole up your back. Look at somebody say, keep the pole up your back. You stay in your position and you don't move. And what's fascinating here is that on a subconscious level, if you look at the picture on the cover of your bulletin, you will understand that just like in The Wiz, it's very similar to being on an auction block. That's right. On a subconscious level, when you see the scarecrow, it looks like he's on an auction block. That's right. And when Dorothy finds the scarecrow, we have no idea of the scarecrow's history. We don't know what scarecrow people have done throughout civilization. We don't know his background. But there's something we do know about the scarecrow. The only reason he's in the position that he's in is because he got crows around him. All right. You see, the crows want to keep him in the field. That's right. And the only reason Scarecrow is still in the field is because of the crows. All right. Well, let me call